My truck hadn't moved an inch from where I parked it when Marla Keene crossed her arms and looked at me the way someone looks at a stain on a white carpet. She didn't bother with pleasantries. She just turned to the tow truck driver, idling behind her, and said, "Tow his truck." Then she turned back to me and told me that men like me should learn how to follow the rules. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I pulled out my phone and made a call. 10 minutes later, Police Chief Grant Holloway stepped out of his patrol vehicle, looked at the tow authorization Marla was holding, looked at the street we were standing on, and said 4 words that made the entire neighborhood go quiet. "Put it back." But that was only the beginning. 3 weeks before Marla Keene tried to have my Ford F-250 pulled from in front of my own home, I was doing what I do on most Saturday mornings, unloading survey equipment from the bed of my truck after a long week in the field. My name is Evan Calder. I'm 38 years old. I work as a licensed land surveyor, which means I spend my days reading plat maps, measuring property boundaries, and pulling deed records from county archives. It's not glamorous work. I drive a beat-up silver pickup, I wear the same rotation of jeans and work boots, and I live in a small house that was built decades before anyone had heard of Oak Hollow Estates. That last part matters more than anything else in this story. My house sits at the edge of what is now a planned community. When the developer came through and built Oak Hollow, he bought up most of the land in the area and subdivided it into the tidy rows of matching homes you see today. But one parcel held out. The owner at the time refused to sell, refused to join, and refused to have anything to do with the homeowners association. That was long before I bought the place, but the legal record of that refusal is written into every relevant document: the county plat, the deed, the subdivision declaration, and the easement filings. My parcel is an outpo parcel. It exists inside the geographic footprint of Oak Hollow Estates the way a piece of a puzzle exists that was cut from a different box. It looks like it belongs, but legally, it never did. Because of my profession, I understood this better than most people would. I had read the plat myself before I ever made an offer on the house. I knew exactly where my property ended and where Oak Hollow began. I should say something about what my house looked like from the street because it mattered to Marla in a way I didn't fully appreciate until later. The place was modest. A single-story ranch with a covered porch, a gravel driveway, and a yard that was neat but not manicured. No decorative shutters. No matching mailbox and house numbers. No HOA-approved paint scheme. It looked exactly like what it was. A house that had existed long before anyone decided the surrounding land should become something curated. On one side of my property line were the uniform lawns and coordinated landscaping of Oak Hollow Estates. On the other side was just mine, ordinary, slightly worn, and entirely its own. I had always thought that contrast was a small thing. I came to realize Marla had been bothered by it from the moment she first saw it. The first time I met Marla Keene, she was walking past my driveway with a clipboard tucked under her arm. I was lifting a tripod out of the truck bed. She stopped, looked at my boots, looked at the truck, looked at the equipment, and asked with complete confidence, "Which house are you working on?" I told her I lived there. She looked at the house, then back at me, then at the truck again. She didn't apologize for assuming I was a contractor. She just said, "Oh, I thought you were here doing work." She gave the truck one more long look, and then told me, almost as an aside, that Oak Hollow didn't really encourage what she called commercial-looking vehicles in the neighborhood. I told her my truck was personal and that my house wasn't part of the HOA anyway. She smiled, not a warm smile, and said, "You're right at the entrance of Oak Hollow. What you do here still affects all of us." I thought about that for a second and said, affecting something and having authority over it are two different things. She didn't like that answer. She walked away without another word, but she glanced back once at the truck before she turned the corner. That glance told me everything I needed to know about what was coming. 2 days later, I opened my mailbox and found an envelope with the Oak Hollow Homeowners Association seal embossed in the upper left corner. Inside was an official violation notice. It informed me that my vehicle, described as an oversized work truck inconsistent with community standards, was in violation of HOA parking regulations. The fine was $250. The notice went on to say that if the violation continued, the vehicle would be subject to towing at the owner's expense. I stood at the mailbox for a moment and nearly laughed. Then I folded the notice, put it in my pocket, and went inside to make coffee. I didn't throw it away. That was the most important decision I made that week. I want to be honest about something. When I saw that violation notice, my first instinct was to ignore it entirely. I wasn't a member of the HOA. Their rules had no jurisdiction over me. Legally, the notice was about as binding as a sticky note from a stranger. But I've spent enough years in land disputes and boundary disagreements to know that ignoring a paper trail is almost always the wrong move. So instead of throwing the notice away, I sat down and wrote a careful, factual email to the HOA. I included my parcel identification number. I attached a copy of the county subdivision plat that clearly showed my property falling outside the Oak Hollow boundary. I referenced the deed and the subdivision declaration by recording number. I asked, politely and specifically, that the violation be voided and my record cleared. Bethany Sloan, who I would later come to know as the HOA treasurer, wrote back within a few hours and said she would look into it. Her tone was professional. Her response was reasonable. I thought maybe that would be the end of it. Then Marla called. She didn't discuss the documents I sent. She didn't acknowledge the parcel number or the plat. She opened by telling me I was making a simple situation unnecessarily complicated. I told her that property lines were actually pretty simple once you looked at the map. She told me I was playing lawyer, and that I clearly didn't understand how HOA enforcement worked. I told her I understood it well enough to know it didn't apply to my address. There was a pause. Then she said, "And I remember this clearly, you're a grown man. I shouldn't have to stand here and explain to you why a decent neighborhood doesn't want to look at that truck every morning." I let the silence run for a moment. Then I asked her, "Are you asking me to follow the rules of an association I'm not a member of?" She said, "I'm asking you to respect the community." I said, "Those are two different things." She ended the call. The next morning, I walked out to get my newspaper and found a yellow sticker on the windshield of my Ford. Bold, black text. "Final warning, subject to tow." I photographed it. I didn't remove it right away. I wanted it in the record. Then I sent a second email to the HOA, this one shorter than the first. I asked them to identify the specific legal authority that permitted Oak Hollow Homeowners Association to tow vehicles from Juniper Court. Juniper Court was the name of the street my house sat on. It was a public road, accepted by the city many years ago when Oak Hollow was first built. The city maintained it. The city owned it. Nobody at HOA had ever, to my knowledge, checked. Nobody wrote back. 2 days passed, then 3. Then the following Friday morning, I was standing in my kitchen with a mug of coffee when I heard the growl of a diesel engine outside. I looked through the window. A tow truck was backing slowly toward the front of my property, and Marla Keene was standing on the sidewalk beside it, clipboard in hand. I set down my coffee and walked outside. The driver, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s named Cole Danner, whose name I'd later see on the side of his truck, was already crouching to look at my front axle. I didn't say anything to him yet. I looked at Marla. She had her violation notices fanned out in her hand like playing cards. She had a photograph of my truck. She had a copy of the HOA parking rules. She had clearly prepared for this moment. I asked evenly, "Who authorized this tow?" Cole pointed to Marla. Marla stepped forward. She told me I had been warned multiple times and had chosen not to comply. I asked her again, the same question I'd been asking in every email. "Is this HOA property?" She didn't answer directly. She told me the truck was in violation of community standards. I asked again, "Is this HOA property?" She said something about the truck being visible from the entrance of Oak Hollow. I kept my voice flat. I kept asking the same question because I knew if she answered it honestly, her entire case evaporated on the spot. A few neighbors had drifted to the edge of their driveways by then. Marla noticed the audience. I could see her posture change. She straightened up and said, loud enough for all of them to hear, "You've been given more than enough chances." Then she looked at Cole and said, "Tow his truck." Cole began attaching the lift mechanism to the front wheels. I turned to him and said, clearly and calmly, "That vehicle is on a public street. I'm formally objecting to this tow." Cole hesitated. He was a working man doing a job. I understood that. He looked between me and Marla. Marla stepped in immediately and told him the HOA would take full responsibility. He kept working. Then Marla looked at me with something I can only describe as satisfaction and said, "Maybe next time you'll understand that standing there looking stubborn doesn't make you right." She thought my calm was weakness. She thought if she pushed hard enough, if she said it in front of enough witnesses, I would back down and go inside. People usually did. I took out my phone. Marla's expression shifted slightly. She asked if I was calling a lawyer. I said no. I dialed the non-emergency line for the town's police department. When the dispatcher picked up, I gave them my address on Juniper Court. I gave them Cole's company name. I gave them the plate of the tow truck. And I said clearly, "A vehicle is being removed from a city street without the owner's consent and without police authorization." Then I hung up. Cole had the front wheels off the ground by this point. Marla told him to keep going. My truck rose at the front end. A small crowd had gathered. I stood on the sidewalk with my arms at my sides, watching, waiting. Then at the end of the block, a dark SUV turned onto Juniper Court. It wasn't a patrol officer. It was a white Crown Vic with the town crest on the door. Police Chief Grant Holloway stepped out. Grant Holloway is not someone who does anything in a hurry. He walked toward the scene at his own pace, hands in his jacket pockets, reading the situation before he said a word. He looked at the tow truck. He looked at my Ford, front end still elevated. He looked at Marla. He looked at me. He looked at the street sign at the corner. Then he started asking questions, one at a time, without any particular urgency. He asked whose truck it was. I said, "Mine." He asked who had ordered the tow. Marla answered before I could. She told him Oak Hollow HOA had authorized it. He asked what violation was cited. Marla handed him her stack of papers and walked him through the complaint. Commercial vehicle, community standards, repeated warnings. Grant read the address on the violation notice. Then he asked one question I could tell Marla hadn't prepared for. "Is Mr. Calder a member of your association?" Marla started to say something about my property bordering the community. Grant interrupted her. He said, "That wasn't my question." The air changed. Bethany, who had arrived quietly sometime in the last few minutes, shifted uncomfortably near the edge of the crowd. Grant pulled out his radio and asked dispatch to run a check on my parcel address and confirm the maintenance status of Juniper Court. The answer came back quickly. Juniper Court was a municipal roadway maintained by the city, not by any private association. Grant then turned to Cole and asked whether he had police authorization for the tow. He didn't. City authorization? No. Was the vehicle abandoned? No. Was it blocking traffic? No. Had it been reported stolen? No. Cole answered each question quickly and honestly. Marla tried to interject that HOA had a standing contract with Danner Recovery. Grant looked at her and said, very simply, "For property belonging to the association." He let that sit for a moment. Marla opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Grant looked at the Ford, front end still hanging in the air, rear wheels still on the ground. Then he looked at Cole and said, "Put it back." Cole lowered the truck without a word. He didn't look at Marla. He didn't look at the crowd. He kept his eyes on the truck and on his equipment, guiding the wheels back down with the careful attention of a man who wanted no part of whatever came next. The hydraulics hissed as the wheels settled back onto the pavement of Juniper Court. Marla's face went through several different expressions in the span of about 5 seconds. Her jaw was tight. Her clipboard was pressed against her chest. Half the neighborhood was standing on their lawns watching. She turned to me and said, her voice lower now, "This isn't over." I looked at her and said, "I hope not." I meant it, because I had already seen something on that violation notice that Marla didn't know I had noticed. And what I'd seen was going to make the rest of this a very different kind of conversation. Grant found me near my truck after Marla had walked away. He told me that the department had received a handful of complaints about towing activity in and around Oak Hollow over the past couple of years, but that most of them had gone nowhere. People paid the fee, got their vehicles back, and moved on. He said this was the first time someone had called while the tow was actively happening. Then he asked me if I still had all the notices Marla had sent. I told him I kept everything. He said, "Don't throw any of it away." That evening, I spread every piece of paper across my kitchen table and started reading very carefully. One line on the final violation notice stopped me cold. In the authorization section, Marla had not just signed as HOA president. Beneath her title, she had written, "Authorized Property Agent, Juniper Court." I set the paper down. I stared at it for a while. In all my years reading land records and ownership filings, I had never once seen HOA jurisdictions described that way for a city-maintained road, because it didn't exist. Oak Hollow had never owned Juniper Court, not for a day. I want to explain something about my job that matters here. A licensed land surveyor doesn't just measure distances and draw lines on a map. We read the history of land. Every parcel has a chain of title, a record of every transfer, every dedication, every boundary change that has ever been made. When a developer builds a subdivision, part of the process is deciding what to keep and what to dedicate to the public. Roads are often dedicated. Parks sometimes are. When a road is dedicated to a municipality and the municipality formally accepts it, that road becomes public property. The developer no longer owns it. The HOA never owned it. Nobody in the neighborhood owns it. It belongs to the public, maintained with public funds, subject to public law. I spent the next 2 evenings pulling records. I retrieved the original Oak Hollow plat from the county recorder's office. I pulled the road dedication filing that the developer had submitted when the subdivision was approved. I found the city resolution formally accepting Juniper Court as a public roadway. I pulled the HOA declaration and all its amendments. I reviewed the easement filings. Every document told the same story. Juniper Court had been a city street for years. Marla's claim of authority over it had no foundation in any recorded document whatsoever. But what bothered me more than the legal gap was something Bethany Sloan told me when she reached out quietly the next afternoon. She said Marla had pushed through what she called a neighborhood appearance enforcement initiative a year earlier. The board had discussed it. They had voted on it. But the scope they approved was narrow. Enforcement could only occur on HOA-owned property. Bethany sent me the meeting minutes. Right there in the record, under new business, no enforcement authority is granted beyond association property. The board had said it plainly. And Marla had done it anyway. I asked Bethany directly, did Marla know that Juniper Court was a city street? Bethany was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I told her twice." That sentence landed harder than anything else she could have said, because there's a difference between someone making a mistake and someone knowing a line exists and crossing it anyway because they've decided the consequences won't come. Marla hadn't been confused. She had been counting on the fact that most people, when told they owe $250 to an authority that sounds official, will simply pay it and move on. I asked Bethany why she hadn't raised the issue more forcefully at the time. She sighed and said, because Marla always had a way of saying she knew how to handle difficult people, and everyone on the board believed her. That was the culture. Authority by confidence. Rules as theater. Compliance enforced not by legitimate power, but by the assumption that nobody would check. I kept pulling records. The county recorder's office had a public terminal, and I had spent enough time there over the years that the staff recognized me. I went through the filings methodically, the way I would approach any survey project. Start with what you know for certain, work outward from there, and don't assume anything until the document confirms it. I found 2 other properties at the edge of Oak Hollow, both outparcels, both predating the HOA, both clearly outside the association boundary on the recorded plat, that had received violation notices from Marla in the past 18 months. One of those owners had a cargo van towed from Juniper Court and paid almost $600 to recover it. I set those documents aside separately. Then, a few days after the tow truck incident, a certified letter arrived in my mailbox. Marla was summoning me to a special HOA hearing. The stated reason was continued hostile conduct toward association representatives. I read it twice. Then I put it with the rest of my files, made myself another cup of coffee, and decided I was going to attend. The Oak Hollow Homeowners Association held its meetings in a clubhouse at the center of the development, a beige building with a dark green awning and a parking lot full of mid-size sedans. On the night of the special hearing, the lot was fuller than usual. Word about the tow truck incident had moved through the neighborhood faster than any HOA notice ever had, and people who normally skip these meetings had apparently decided this one was worth showing up for. I arrived a few minutes early, sat in the back row, and waited. Marla was already seated at the board table when I arrived. She had her folders arranged neatly in front of her. Bethany sat beside her, hands folded, face neutral. 2 other board members sat further down the table. Marla called the meeting to order, acknowledged that the hearing had been convened to address a specific situation, and then proceeded to describe me in terms I can summarize without going through each one. Uncooperative, confrontational, disruptive to community standards, and disrespectful toward HOA representatives. She said it all in the measured, regretful tone of someone who wishes things didn't have to come to this. I almost admired the performance. She described the violations. She described the warnings. She described the tow truck incident as an example of someone refusing to accept legitimate community governance. She talked about the investment residents had made in their homes, the care they put into the appearance of the neighborhood, and the importance of maintaining standards. Then she said the line that made the room go a little quiet. A man who drives an old work truck around may not care about what the neighborhood looks like, but the people who have seriously invested in their homes do. A few people shifted in their seats. I didn't react. I watched the room. I saw Bethany look down at the table. Marla finished. She looked at me and asked if I had anything to say for myself. I said I had 3 questions, if the board would permit them. She said yes with the tone of someone granting a small favor. I turned to the full board, not just to Marla, and asked my first question: does my parcel fall within the boundaries described in the Oak Hollow HOA declaration? Marla began a response about neighboring properties. Bethany spoke first. She said, clearly, no. I asked the second question: does Oak Hollow Homeowners Association own or hold any recorded property interest in Juniper Court? Again, Marla tried to redirect. Bethany said no. I asked the third question: did the board vote to authorize towing activity on city property? Bethany said no, and added that the minutes reflected the opposite. Marla turned to Bethany with an expression I can only describe as deeply unhappy. She said something about internal discussions being private. Bethany said the minutes were an official record and had been properly requested. The room was paying attention now in a different way than it had been 10 minutes ago. I laid the county plat on the table, then the road dedication filing, then a copy of the city's acceptance resolution, then the meeting minutes Bethany had sent me. I didn't give a speech. I just said, so what exactly am I here being disciplined for, failing to comply with authority that the HOA never legally had? Nobody answered. A few residents in the audience began asking their own questions, directed at the board. Marla said the legal technicalities were being taken out of context. I said property lines tend to become very relevant the moment someone tries to tow a vehicle from one side to the other. The door at the back of the clubhouse opened. Police Chief Grant Holloway walked in, followed by a representative from the city's code enforcement office. They didn't announce themselves dramatically. They took seats near the back. Grant nodded at the board and said they were there to clarify a few jurisdictional questions that had come to the department's attention. The city code enforcement officer introduced himself, set a folder on the table, and then placed a photograph in the middle of it, a photograph of the sign at the entrance to Juniper Court. Not my truck, not the tow truck. A sign that read, Oak Hollow, private road, residents only. The officer looked at the board and asked, in a quiet and unhurried voice, who authorized this sign? Every head in the room turned toward Marla. The sign was the piece I hadn't fully connected. I had focused on the towing, on the violation notices, on the property records. I hadn't considered the sign at the entrance to Juniper Court that implied to every resident and every driver that the road was private HOA property. That sign had been there for over a year. The city had never issued a permit for it. The board had never voted on it. It had simply appeared one afternoon, bolted to a post at the corner, and nobody had questioned it because Marla Keene had a way of making things look official. The city code enforcement officer explained that placing signage on a public right-of-way without a permit was a city ordinance violation. He also noted that signage suggesting a public road was private property constituted a misrepresentation that could create legal complications for the municipality. He was not loud about it. He didn't raise his voice. He just laid the facts on the table the way I had laid my documents, and let them speak. Marla tried to suggest that the sign had been a board decision. Bethany immediately pulled her meeting minutes from her folder and set them on the table as well. There was no vote on record authorizing any signage on Juniper Court. No discussion. No proposal. One board member, a man I'd seen at a few neighborhood events but never spoken to, said he remembered Marla mentioning the idea and saying that if the city didn't object, she would proceed. He said no one had formally agreed. He said he assumed she had checked with the city first. She hadn't. She had assumed, as she seemed to assume about many things, that her position gave her permission to act and that compliance was someone else's job. Grant Holloway confirmed what I had already documented. Juniper Court was a municipal roadway. No HOA authority extended to it. The tow truck incident was being formally recorded as an unauthorized tow from a public street, and the department was opening a review of other towing-related complaints from the area. The city officer outlined what the HOA would be required to do: cease all enforcement activity on Juniper Court, remove the private road sign, conduct a review of past towing incidents involving non-OA properties and public roads, and stop sending violation notices to parcels outside the association boundary. A resident near the middle of the room stood up and asked the question that no one on the board was going to ask. If Marla knew the street wasn't HOA property, why did she keep authorizing tows from it? The question sat in the air. Marla said she had acted in the best interest of the community. She said that intent mattered. She said the sign had been meant to protect residents from cut-through traffic. Nobody in the room seemed satisfied with those answers. Bethany's expression was the clearest indicator of all. She had the look of someone who had been carrying a weight for a long time and had just been relieved of it in the worst possible way. Marla turned to me near the end of the session and said I had deliberately humiliated her in front of her neighbors. I said nothing for a moment. Then I pointed to the certified letter she had sent me. I said, "I didn't call this meeting." I paused. "You did." The board moved into executive session and asked the public, including me, to step out while they deliberated. I was fine with that. I had said what needed to be said. I stood outside the clubhouse in the night air, leaning against my truck, and waited. 15 minutes later, Bethany came through the side door. She told me the board had voted to immediately suspend Marla's enforcement authority, pending a full review of her actions. I thanked her and drove home. There was a new envelope on my front door when I got there. No HOA letterhead this time, a personal attorney's return address. Marla was threatening to sue me for defamation. I'll admit the attorney's letter gave me about 30 seconds of unease before I read it carefully. Defamation requires a false statement of fact, communicated to others, causing harm to someone's reputation. I ran through everything I had done in the weeks leading up to this moment. I had sent emails to the HOA. I had provided public records to the board and to city officials. I had asked questions at a meeting I had been formally summoned to attend. I had not posted anything publicly. I had not contacted any news organizations. I had not called any of my neighbors to tell them what I thought of Marla Keene. Every document I had shared was a matter of public record before I ever touched it. I had not invented anything. I had not interpreted anything. I had simply found the records and shown them to the people who needed to see them. I reached out to an attorney named Reed Benson, who handled property and civil matters in the county. I had met him briefly through a professional connection years earlier and knew him to be methodical and direct. He read the letter the same day I sent it. Then he called me. His first question was whether I had posted anything about Marla online. I had not. His second question was whether I had contacted any reporters. I had not. His third question was whether I had organized any kind of public campaign against her. I had not. He said, "Then she's trying to scare you." He reviewed the documents I had shared and confirmed that every one of them was a public record. County filings, city resolutions, HOA meeting minutes. None of them contained a single statement I had made about Marla personally. I had never called her corrupt. I had never accused her of a crime. I had asked questions and provided paperwork. Reed drafted a brief response to Marla's attorney. It didn't argue at length. It simply asked them to identify, with specificity, any statement of fact that Evan Calder had made that was false, and to explain how any such statement caused reputational harm beyond what was already contained in the public record. No response came. The HOA completed its internal review during the same period. The findings were laid out in a formal letter from the newly reorganized board. Marla had acted outside the authority granted to her by the board. She had sent violation notices to property owners who were not members of the association. She had authorized towing on public streets without city authorization. She had installed signage on a public right-of-way without a permit. She had been informed on multiple occasions, by Bethany and at least one other board member, that Juniper Court was not association property, and she had proceeded anyway. The board's conclusion was as straightforward as her violations. Marla Keene was removed as HOA president, effective immediately. No courtroom, no police tape, no dramatic confrontation in a parking lot. She didn't go to prison. She wasn't fined by the city for the sign. She received a notice of violation and the HOA paid the cost of removal. The punishment fit the offense almost perfectly. She had used the authority of her position to enforce rules that didn't apply. That position was taken from her. That was the consequence. Danner Recovery, Cole's company, quietly updated their internal policy in the weeks that followed. They would no longer accept tow requests from HOA accounts for vehicles on public roadways without first confirming ownership and jurisdiction. Cole told me this himself. When I saw him at the gas station one evening, he seemed relieved. He said it wasn't the first time a job had felt off from the start. The owner of the cargo van, who had paid nearly $600 2 years earlier, was contacted by the HOA's new acting board. He received a full reimbursement within the month. Bethany became acting president, at least temporarily. She wasn't looking to be a long-term administrator. She told me in the parking lot of a coffee shop one afternoon that the whole experience had reminded her of something she thought HOAs sometimes forgot. That an association was not a government. It didn't have police powers. It couldn't levy taxes. It couldn't seize property. Its authority existed only within its own boundaries, only over its own members, and only when it followed its own rules. She said the situation had been allowed to grow because no one had been willing to say that out loud until the paper trail made it impossible to ignore. I told her that was probably the most accurate summary of everything that had happened. She laughed, a little tiredly. I think she was just glad it was done. About a week after Marla was removed, I was washing my truck in the driveway on a quiet Thursday afternoon when I heard a heavy engine coming down Juniper Court. A city maintenance truck rolled into view and stopped at the corner. 2 workers climbed out, walked to the post at the edge of the road, and without any ceremony whatsoever, began removing the sign. Oak Hollow, private road, residents only. They unbolted it, loaded it into the back of the truck, and replaced it with a standard city street marker. The whole thing took less than 15 minutes. Juniper Court looked the way it had always been. A public road, belonging to everyone, governed by nobody's clipboard. The HOA sent a formal letter to all residents shortly after. It confirmed the corrected boundaries of enforcement authority. It voided all violation notices that had been issued to properties outside the association. It established a new approval process requiring board votes before any towing could be authorized. It acknowledged the review of past incidents and confirmed that eligible owners would be contacted regarding reimbursement. The letter was 4 paragraphs long. It used plain language. It was signed by Bethany Sloan as acting president. There was no apology from Marla. There was no explanation. There was just the institutional acknowledgement that the old policy was wrong, and this was how it was going to be corrected. I saw Marla once more after all of it. It was a Sunday evening. I was drying down the hood of my truck with a chamois cloth when I heard footsteps on the sidewalk. She was walking alone, no clipboard, no folder, wearing a cardigan and carrying a reusable grocery bag. She slowed when she saw me. She stopped. She looked at the truck for a long moment, the same silver Ford F-250 that had started all of this, sitting in exactly the same spot on Juniper Court where it had always been. Then she looked at me. She asked, flat and tired, "Are you satisfied?" I thought about the question for a moment. I wasn't happy that things had gone the way they had. I didn't take pleasure in her losing a position she had clearly cared about. I wasn't interested in her embarrassment. What I had wanted from the beginning was something very small: to park my truck in front of my own house on a public street without being told I needed permission from an organization I had never joined. I said, "I'm satisfied that you now know where the line is." She held my gaze for a few seconds. Then she picked up her bag and kept walking. I watched her go. I turned back to the truck and finished drying the hood. The evening was quiet. A few birds. A car passing at the far end of the block. Nobody watching, nobody waiting, nobody keeping score. Just a man washing his truck on a public street that had always been a public street. There was nothing spectacular about how it ended. No medal, no apology, no standing ovation from the neighbors. The county plat still showed my parcel outside the Oak Hollow boundary, same as it always had. Juniper Court was still a city road, same as it always had been. I was still a land surveyor who drove an old pickup and wore the same boots every day. None of that changed, but something else did. The next time anyone in Oak Hollow thought about sending a violation notice to a property they weren't sure they had authority over, or calling a tow truck for a vehicle parked on a road they didn't own, or bolting a sign to a post on a public right-of-way because no one had stopped them yet, there was now a paper trail in the county records, in the city's code enforcement files, and in the HOA's own meeting minutes showing exactly how that kind of thing ended. I thought about what Marla had believed when she first saw me lifting equipment out of my truck that Saturday morning. She had decided, in that first glance, that she understood exactly who I was and what I was worth in the context of her community. A working man. A vehicle that didn't belong. Someone who could be educated about the way things worked here, because people like that were usually easier to move than they were to argue with. She had been wrong about all of it. Not because I was secretly something more impressive than she assumed, but because the land didn't care about her assumptions. The plat didn't care. The road dedication filing didn't care. The city's records had been sitting in that archive for years, patient and indifferent, waiting for someone to actually read them. Marla had looked at my truck and decided it proved I didn't belong here. It turned out to be the thing that showed everyone else who had actually crossed a line. The police chief only needed to say 3 words. Put it back. The rest of it, the records said for me.